Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives. Incomes, jobs, debts, ours, our children's. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life, preparing me to offer you updates every week. Before we begin today, a couple of announcements I think will interest you. I'm happy to mention to those of you in the Los Angeles area or who might be there next weekend that from the 3rd to the 5th of November at the Los Angeles Trade Technical College, 400 West Washington Street, there will be the Left Coast Forum, a replica of the Left Forum that happens every spring in New York City, but its own West Coast variation. I will be talking the evening of November 3rd, but I urge you, if you are interested, if you are in the area, this will be a chance to see what academics, what activists are doing in the United States to make the kinds of changes that ever more of you are interested in. You can find out more by going either to Left Coast Forum or to leftforum.org. And that will give you all the information about the speakers and the panels and all the activities. The other announcement is a response to what many of you have asked for. You wanted to know, how has Marxian economics, an approach to economics that is critical of capitalism, how has that evolved in recent decades? What's going on in the field of Marxian economics? How have criticisms and proposals to go beyond capitalism, how have they evolved in that tradition? It's an important question, and there's plenty of answers, but many of them are gathered together in a new book that I thought you might be interested in, published by the very large international publisher known as Routledge International, or Routledge Publishers, based in the United Kingdom but globally distributed. The book is called A Handbook of Marxian Economics, published this year, 2017, so it's right up to date. It's got a group of editors who've assembled a whole raft of different articles on different subjects, so you can kind of sample the field. The lead editor is David Brennan, Brennan, so I recommend, if you're interested in what Marxian economics has to say, this Handbook of Marxian Economics, edited by David Brennan and others, is a useful way to get into this material. Let's turn then to the economic updates for this week. The first one captured my attention, not just because it's a horrible story, and it is, but also because it tells us something about what's going on in the American economy from an angle that you don't often hear about. Here's the way this story goes. Across the country, towns and counties are having more and more difficulty performing their basic functions. Why? The answer is not far to search for. Corporations in America have dozens, literally, of ways of evading their share of taxes. Wealthy people, likewise, either have the laws in place to allow them to escape taxation, or they buy the political influence that gets them those laws. We know the story. And the end result is that cities and towns across the country are not able to raise the money, the tax revenue that in the past funded basic functions. And here's an example. One of the things that cities and towns and counties and states have to do is to handle probation. If people violate the law, anything from a speeding ticket to more serious offenses, they can be found guilty in the judicial system and be required, for example, to pay a fine and or to undergo probation. You don't go to prison, but you are kind of in a limbo place. You have to really behave yourself and do nothing wrong for a while, and then you're done with your probation. But of course, to handle this system, you have to have probation officers, probation offices, all of that. To save money, cities and counties and states are beginning to privatize probation. And recently, in Craighead County, Arkansas, it kind of blew up on them, and attention finally was turned. Here's what it turns out happened in Craighead County, Arkansas, but it happens everywhere. The system becomes corrupted. Here's how it works. The public institution, the city, the town, the county, says we can't afford the probation system anymore, and instead of shutting it down, which would raise other kinds of problems, they privatize it. They turn it over to a private probation company. So here's what happens. You violate the law, a speeding ticket. The judge says you must pay X dollars of fine, and you must be on probation for a year, 18 months, whatever. The private company now administers this. If you don't pay the exact amount of money on the right day, the private probation company has the right to assign fees and penalties, and then to jack it up, say you now owe not just the original fine, but all on top of that, fees and penalties. Why is this different from any other kind of situation? Because if you don't pay, the probation company explains to you, you're going to go to jail. Now, normally in a Western law for centuries, we don't put people in jail who haven't paid fines. Other ways are found to deal with this problem. Otherwise, you're putting poor people, those who miss a payment they owe, into jail, and that's what we used to call poorhouse. We don't do that anymore. But it turns out, when a system begins to break down, that the things we didn't do anymore turn up getting done anyway. Moving right along to the second one, I found another statistic this last week that illustrates that if there's an economic recovery going on, it doesn't include large numbers of people. In this case, it has to do with people having their electricity shut off because they haven't paid or paid in full their electric bills. Let me give you some of the numbers. I think they will stun you the way they stunned me. Last summer, 900,000 homes in Texas went dark because of unpaid bills. That's triple the number 10 years ago in the state of Texas. Number two, California, 714,000 homes, the most on record for the state of California. Across the United States as a whole, millions of people are being disconnected from electricity. And let me remind everyone, that doesn't just mean that your toaster isn't working and you can't watch TV. It means that if you have a child in school who had an assignment to work with a computer to do something, he or she can't do it. The ramifications of being cut off of electricity have long-term social consequences that ought to make a society stop and pay some attention. But the story actually gets worse. The Trump administration released its 2018 budget. And in that budget, they got rid of the LIHEAP program. In case you don't know what that is, let me tell you. Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. It's a program of the federal government that helps poor people, if they qualify, to pay at least part of their electricity bills. Last year, 2.9 million households, wow, turned and got some help. So why is it being canceled by the Trump administration? Well, according to Mick Mulvaney, the director of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, he cited the figure of 11,000 people who didn't qualify but who got help. Now let's see. 2.9 million people disconnected who needed help. 11,000, which is 0.0001% of this, cheated in some way, weren't qualified, were even dead in some cases. Is there corruption in government programs? Usually some. But to use a tiny fraction of corruption to cancel out what millions of people need, there's no justification for that. There never was. I want to give you some good news. And it's about the country called New Zealand, halfway around the world. They just have a new government, led by a 37-year-old woman, Jacinda Ardern. And she, the head of the Labour Party there, is quite an interesting candidate. She is in charge of a coalition government. There are two other parties together with her that have formed the government and taken it away from the last 10 years of a conservative government. The conservative government in when the global capitalist crash happened in 2008 and stayed in power to administer an austerity program afterwards. The people of New Zealand have had enough, and they abandoned the conservatives and turned the government over to Jacinda Ardern and her coalition partners. Here are some of the things she ran her election on. The election happened last month in September, and so we know exactly what she's committed to. Her biggest issue was that it was shameful, in her mind, that New Zealand, one of the world's industrialized economies, has the worst problem of homelessness of any of them. And for her, she called this a quote-unquote failure of capitalism. Her words. She said you judge a system, among other things, by whether it provides the most basic needs of a population. Housing is a basic need. To be the #1 country for homelessness in the world is a failure of that system in New Zealand. She's on tap to raise the minimum wage to the equivalent of $11.50 per hour. We don't have anything remotely like that. We still have a federal minimum wage at $7.25. And her coalition partners are pushing to raise it from $11.50 to around $15 or $16. So there the government is doing what we still have to have millions of people demonstrating out in front of McDonald's or Walmarts to maybe get in a few years. A remarkable turnaround in New Zealand, and it's not the only country where this is happening. I want to talk to you also about an update that has to do with this lingering struggle over the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. I'm going to assume you are familiar with what President Trump decided to do after he and the Republicans failed to override that bill in the Congress. They didn't get enough votes. So what President Trump did was announce something that he can do just as president. He will not allow the government to give to the insurance company the promised subsidies for low-income people to get health insurance. So here's how this works. The law mandates that the insurance companies must give lower rates to people who qualify, who have little or no income. So that's continuing. The president cannot stop that. What the president can do is not give to the insurance companies the subsidies that they got to help them pay for the cost of giving insurance at a low discounted rate to poor people. So it's interesting. What is the insurance industry going to do? And they've made no secret of their plans. If they don't get the subsidies that the federal government promised them in the Affordable Care Act, and if they are required by law to give a low rate to poor people, then the only way they can pull that off, they say, is one of two things. Raise the rates of everybody else to compensate them for what they have to give in a discounted rate to the poor. In other words, set the health insurance needs of the poor against those of everybody else to create the maximum anger, resentment, hostility. And the second option for the insurance companies, quit the whole business. Just cancel everybody out and stop providing it. Some companies are expected to go one way and some the other. The losers, the mass of the American people. It is an extraordinary exercise in bad government, not serving the people who elected it to go in there. Before turning to the next economic update, let me remind you to make use of the two websites that we maintain for your use. These websites allow you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to see what we're doing on YouTube. In other words, to be a partner and share with us the kinds of work which involved collecting this information, making these analyses, and then distributing and sharing them with other interested people. The two websites are rdwolf.com and democracyatwork.info. These are also websites that allow you to communicate with us, to tell us what you like and don't like, what you would like to see covered. We read these emails and we use them in organizing the programming that we offer to you each week. So please, make use of both websites. They're there for your purpose. They're updated many times a day. Share what you find there with others. That's why we put it there. rdwolf.com and democracyatwork.info. The next update has to do as much with who said something as with what this person said. The person is Nigar Woods, the dean at Oxford University in England, one of the most establishment places you could find in the world of economics. And here's what Dean Woods said in the middle of October publicly. Neo-liberalism, the form that capitalism has taken in the last 2 or 3 decades, is on trial, said Dean Woods. In the United Kingdom, where Dean Woods is located, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn accuses neoliberalism of increasing homelessness, rather like the new Prime Minister of New Zealand, throwing children into poverty and causing wages to fall, in many cases, below subsistence. A quarter of a century ago, it was said that if the government intervenes in the economy, it makes matters worse. Now we see, says Dean Woods, that if you remove the government, it can have the same effect, and that therefore we have to rethink this. And then Dean Woods has the courage to say what so few of the people in this kind of a position dare to say, that the fastest growing economic units in the world over the last 10 years have been overwhelmingly state-managed, state interventionist types of capitalism, exactly the opposite of what used to be argued. China is the fastest growing, but so is India, so are many other countries. And not only are they growing faster than the neoliberal, the government gets out of the picture countries, but the government gets out of the picture countries like Britain and the United States are having more and more troubles. Their inequality is getting worse, while that in those other countries isn't. Their child poverty rates in those hands off from the government are getting worse, while those in the government intervention are getting better. In other words, the wind is changing. And where before it was popular to say private capitalism is solution, government is the problem, it's now reversing. It's the private capitalism that's the problem and the government intervention that's the solution. This has happened before, this oscillation between more and less government intervention. And it is usually justified either way with the same arguments. In the 1970s, Reagan and Thatcher said, the government's too much involved, everything will get better if we get the government out. And people believed it. Now it's going the other way, and people increasingly are believing it. I understand the anguish about the bad performance of neoliberal capitalism. Getting the government out of all kinds of things is part of what brought us to the crash of 2008. So I understand wanting to push in the other direction. But I would like to add an analytical understanding from the history of economics. Maybe the problem isn't more or less government intervention. Yes, that's what the profession loves to debate. But it's an old debate, and it's a very stale debate. Because maybe the problem isn't which form of capitalism we got. Maybe the problem is that we don't look beyond these two forms, that we don't seem to be able to manage to think of an economy as either organized into corporations that do whatever they want, or organized into corporations that do pretty much what they want, but the government limits them and controls them and regulates them. Maybe we go back and forth between the two forms of capitalism because the problem isn't the form of capitalism, the problem is capitalism itself. The problem is a system in which a tiny group of people, the heads of the big corporation, the boards of directors, the major shareholders, pretty much have the cards in their hands. And all we're debating is whether the government limits them a little more, a little less. But maybe the problem isn't the limits, more or less. Maybe the problem is we shouldn't allow a small group of people in an economic system to make all the decisions that everybody else has to live with. Maybe the problem is we don't have a democratic economic system, and we never did. And we're now facing the music that pretending that all we have to discuss is a little more government intervention, a little less, misses the boat, misses the issue, keeps our debate very narrowly limited instead of open to asking the more fundamental questions. The next economic update has to do with the way that the United States is exceptional, is unique. We are the only country among the advanced industrial countries in the world that does not have a federally mandated paid vacation time. In other words, there's no law in the United States the way there is in Britain, France, and Germany, and Italy, and Scandinavia, and on and on and on. We don't have this law which says that a working man or woman who goes to work every week, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, all that, must be given X number of weeks of paid vacation, a time to relax, a time to be away from the job, a time to recoup your relationships with your children and with your spouse and with your community, to recharge your batteries. In France, it's 5 weeks. I know the French economy pretty well, and I know that the French working class will not give that up without a catastrophic struggle. It means too much to them. They've built their lives around this. Why is the United States unable, unwilling? The working people in other countries fought bitterly to get this time off. The American working class didn't, or at least it didn't yet. And the question is why? But there's a bigger question which the Europeans now have to face too. Because you fought for it in the past doesn't mean you'll keep it. The new leadership in places like France, with Mr. Macron, are interested in reducing it, maybe even eliminating it. It turns out that in a modern capitalist system, whatever the working class achieves in benefits, in job security, in wages, is always tentative, is mostly temporary. Why? Because the ultimate decision is not in their hands. They fight for it. If they're lucky, they get it. But they're always facing an employer class who is as interested today as it was last month, last year, last century in getting it back, taking these benefits away, reducing them. All across Europe, these benefits, like paid vacation time, are being eroded, are being picked to death. It turns out that if a union or a whole working class fights for something with an adversary employer, Even when it wins, it discovers, usually not very long later, that the winning is temporary. You're always in the struggle, and the other side is always looking to take it away. That's why people get interested in things like worker co-ops, because then the workers are on both sides of the discussion. They are the workers who do the work, but they are also together their own employer. Then there isn't the adversary situation, and then you don't have to worry that the other will take it away from you after you've struggled. The last economic update we'll have time for has to do with an entity you probably never heard of. Families for Excellent Schools, FESA. Who are these people? Well, they pretend, and they do a lot of publicity to push this, that they represent a certain point of view among parents of school children and concerned citizens. And so they battle to get certain goals, particularly recently in Massachusetts and other states, New York among them. They have been fighting to expand the freedom of charter schools, to do end runs around the old rules of what can and cannot happen in a public school, to employ people who haven't the qualifications, to take shortcuts, to impose all kinds of quasi-ethical behaviors on teachers and students in terms of what public teachers have gotten. But why I am telling you this is that it turns out that a new law and a new research by the Boston Globe in Massachusetts found out that a tiny number of very wealthy people bankroll the, ready? Families for Excellent Schools. And they've been fighting because they have interests, business interests in running charter schools, in servicing charter schools. They want privatization of education because it's a realm of much profit. And in America, they can parade themselves as a popular organization because they have the money. Well, their efforts were defeated in Massachusetts by a groundswell of organization from below, which raised lots of little bits of money from union teachers and so on. But often the victories go the other way. And when that happens, we face a society which allows money to trump a democratic decision-making process. That's why change is the order of the day. We've come to the end of the first half of Economic Update. Thank you very much for being with us. Stay with us. After a short intermission, we will be right back.